Thank you very much for your succinct and very insightful presentation. And I'd like to raise to each of you one or two questions. First, Bob, I enjoyed your presentation in the sense that you meant we need to seek interim agreement about freezing North Korea's nuclear activity. That's an interesting concept. And what do you think will be the condition for resuming this kind of diplomacy or talk with North Korea before the U.S. begins this kind of diplomacy? You said that diplomacy should be backed by pressure, and we are engaging in pressuring North Korea through international sanction. Then my question to you is when and what will be the condition of the resuming so-called diplomacy? That is my first question. And you also mentioned one very sensitive and important issue, that is parallel talk on denuclearization and the issue of replacing armistice regime into a kind of peace regime. And what do you think would be the U.S. government's intention when they talk about peace talk or peace agreement or peace regime in more concrete terms? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yoon. Two questions. First, on preconditions for resumption of negotiations. I think it's important, let me reemphasize that we're not ready today to resume talks. I don't think the North Koreans feel any pressure. I don't think they feel they have any incentive to negotiate seriously. That's why the priority today must be pressure. Only when pressure is effective will they see some benefit in negotiating seriously. So what should be the conditions? I think for the United States and presumably other partners, it would be unacceptable to negotiate while North Korea was continuing to make progress on its strategic programs. So I think before we sit down together in denuclearization talks, it's essential that North Korea, first of all, recommit to the September 2005 six-party joint statement, which establishes complete denuclearization as the ultimate goal. Now, that's not going to be achieved right away or even for the foreseeable future, but that must be the goal. And it also must agree not to carry out any nuclear weapons tests, any flight tests of long-range missiles, or any satellite launches. I think that's the prerequisite to sitting down. But I think there needs to be some assurance that before too long, the six-party process will produce a freeze, a suspension of all nuclear activity at Young-kwan, with the International Atomic Energy Agency coming in to verify that suspension of activity. And also, I think the North Koreans early in the process need to admit that they are engaged in nuclear activity outside Young-kwan, including uranium enrichment. Early in the process, I think it's too much to ask that they turn over the fissile material that they have produced. But early on, they have to at least admit that there are these facilities and that these facilities will be subject to negotiation early in the negotiating process. Let me say something about the parallel process of talking about denuclearization and talking about a peace regime. Now, I agree with I agree with the notion that we shouldn't really be talking about peace treaty. If by peace treaty the North Koreans really are referring to a bilateral U.S. DPRK agreement, that's unacceptable to the United States. The parties to any agreement, arrangement, need to be at a minimum the United States, North Korea, South Korea, and China. But there are broader elements to a peace regime, including confidence-building measures, military confidence-building measures, arms control, other kinds of economic and cultural exchanges. Peace regime is broader than peace treaty, and that's what we should be shooting for. Part of the process should be U.S. DPRK normalization. Eventually, the exchange of ambassadors and embassies and normal diplomatic relations. But this can only come at the end of the process. The processes should be parallel, but the establishment of U.S.-North Korean diplomatic relations should only come at the time of complete denuclearization. So it's going to be a long-term process.
One more brief question to you. Probably, in my personal view, the U.S. government may face the dilemma when it wants to focus on freezing North Korea's nuclear program before we talk on denuclearization later. But probably some countries or some international observers may think that U.S. government has recognized North Korea as a de facto nuclear state. How would the U.S. government avoid giving that kind of wrong impression to international society? How would you solve that kind of dilemma?
The United States and most countries of the world will never accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. The goal of the United States will always be complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. That's why I use the term interim agreement. A freeze should be an interim measure en route to denuclearization. Now, I think we're all realistic enough to know that denuclearization is not going to take place quickly. It's going to take time. It's going to take probably a long, long time. But we should always make clear that the goal is complete denuclearization, and that's why we shouldn't begin the process until North Korea has actually reaffirmed the September 2005 goal of complete denuclearization.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Sun Shefeng, I have some questions to you. You made a very interesting presentation suggesting some kind of alternative hierarchical security order in this region. Since our topic this morning is specifically on North Korean issue, I would like to ask a few questions to you. In my view, Chinese government this time has been more cooperative in applying international sanction against North Korea than before. What made that kind of change possible this time? And my second question is, how long would it last? International society as a whole is very curious about how long this strong sanction by China would continue and how strictly it will continue to apply that sanction. And my last question to you is, Professor Kim Sung-han made an interesting policy recommendation to China, that is, China had better send a clear message to North Korean government that it can reduce oil supply if they do not cooperate. So what is your response to these questions?
Okay, thank you for your question. That's my basic idea. That is just mentioned in my presentation. That's in the context of the United States security hierarchy in this region, okay, for the self-help states, including China, when they manage their security environment, they need to consider at least two factors. The first, that is United States security hierarchy, and the second, other self-help states. And in the North Korea problem and the Korea Peninsula problem, it's more complicated that we have shared interests with South Korea. Okay, so for China always make efforts to integrate South Korea, North Korea, and the United States, okay, into one framework to manage all the concerns from the three parties. And when China deal with the policy toward Japan, it's less complicated for me. That's the only three parties, or even we can consider just the two parties, because Japan and China relations suffer from the more competition and frustrations. So this time, and China now make more efforts to engage with the North Korea nuclear issues. I think that China adopt the same approach, that China need to consider the concerns of the United States, especially South Korea, and China also to integrate other parties, including North Korea, that into one framework. I think that China adopted a similar approach that almost 14 years ago, just mentioned by Professor Robert, that okay, we always mention that the agreement in the 2005. I think that the 2005 agreement is a possibly successful story for the regional countries to make the joint efforts to integrate the countries in this region into one framework. But now maybe we face the new situation. We are facing the new factors. But I think that the general direction should not be changed. Just that we still need to integrate that all the relevant parties, their concerns, into the one package of the solutions to that.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kim Sung-han, I have two questions to you. One is, in my view, there seems to be a difference in nuances between the US government and Korean government these days on what to do in the future. For example, peace agreement or peace system issue. And our government seems to have focused on the sanction aspect of international sanction, rather than talking about some kind of parallel approach or two-track approach or something like that. While the US government, for example, Secretary Kerry clearly mentioned the possibility of having both denuclearization talk and discussing this replacement of Army's regime. So what do you think about this gap in nuances, and how we can narrow this gap? And my second question is, I'm a little bit concerned the possible escalation of crisis on the Korean Peninsula, despite, political leaders in both North and South don't have the intention of attacking or provoking the other side. What I'm saying is unintended situation which goes beyond our control, because we don't have communication channel between the North and South through which we can understand the intention of the other party, so that we can reduce the possibility of unwanted confrontation. So could you comment on those 2 points?
Thank you, Minister Yoon, for those 2 excellent questions. The first one is related with kind of a nuance, the differences between Washington and Seoul. I don't see a big difference between our 2 capitals in the sense that both of us put more emphasis on sanctions which should be implemented for a foreseeable future until North Korea takes some meaningful denuclearization measures. So in that sense, I think the Washington has no disagreements. But what if North Korea shows some meaningful denuclearization measures, such as nuclear freezing? So that's why I mentioned in that case, we need to verify if they really mean it or not. Okay, so if that kind of a thing happens, I think as Bob mentioned, we could consider kind of a dual track approach in which we can resume our 6-party talks and then begin to talk about how denuclearization will be realized. At the same time, if nuclear freezing is verified by re-inviting IAEA inspectors, then we can start a peace forum where we can talk about how to establish peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So sanctions, as you may agree, are just a tactical tool. If we are interested in making sanctions a strategic tool, we have to combine it with a dialogue and policy. So in that sense, I think a Korean government appears to believe we need at least 3 to 6 months of implementation of sanctions to see whether it is working or not, after which we can consider kind of a dual track approach, as Bob mentioned. Okay. And your second question, how to avoid the escalation of tension on the Korean Peninsula, which I believe is very, very important. By the way, as long as North Korea relies on so-called strategic provocations, such as nuclear test or long-range missile test, that kind of possibility is not very high. But if North Korea conducts so-called conventional military provocations against the South, I think the South Korean military is fully poised to retaliate against the North, probably in disproportional way rather than proportional way, because they didn't have a chance to do so after Cheonan incident. So if North Korea is rational enough, meaning if they are able to weigh cost and benefits of their future behavior, I strongly recommend the North Korean leadership to refrain from taking conventional military provocations against the South. If this kind of a rationality is maintained, I think we can avoid possible escalation of war or armed conflict. And also, even if it happens, I think South Korean military will, I hope, be responding to those provocations in a proportional way rather than disproportional way.
Okay, thank you very much. Bob, do you have any comment?
I just want to add, Young-kwan, on the question of whether there's a gap or a nuanced difference in the U.S. and ROK positions. I think there's no gap whatsoever. I'm no longer a serving official, so I can't speak authoritatively, but from everything I know of the U.S. position, it's identical to the ROK position.
I'm very glad to hear that. Okay, good. Actually, I have more than a dozen questions here, and one problem for me is that I cannot read all these memos while I am chairing this session. So I don't know how I can solve this dilemma, but I have a few questionnaires that I read, and I'd like to give each of you some questions. For example, my question to Bob is, according to Mr. Young-kwan, he thinks that during the Clinton administration, while pursuing North Korea diplomacy, there was widely shared notion that North Korea would collapse soon. And was it true? And how much that kind of notion was really shared in policymakers in Washington, D.C. at that time? And are there many people who still believe so, even these days? This is one question, and this is another question. What should we do if North Korea test the fifth nuclear, if they, fifth round of nuclear test, and also, launch another long-range missile, because there seems to be some kind of consensus that it would be a matter of time before North Korea do that.
The Clinton administration, and I can't speak authoritatively for the Clinton administration, I was a serving official then. The Clinton administration, back in the 90s, and when it was negotiating the agreed framework, did not assume the collapse of the North Korean regime. It concluded the agreed framework, perhaps hoping that sooner or later this regime would fall of its own dead weight, but it didn't conclude the agreement on the assumption, on the premise that it would collapse. Are there those today in Washington who would like to see the early demise of this regime? Sure, there are many people, but I don't think there's any overestimation of the U.S. ability to bring about regime change in the North. Perhaps if sanctions are enforced very tightly, contradictions within the North will be sharpened. Maybe it will lead to some questioning within the North about the leadership of Kim Jong-un. Who knows? But I don't believe we can base our policy on any assumption, any prediction of the early collapse of this regime. What should we do if there's a fifth test? I think if there's a fifth test, I would look immediately to China and see what China would do. I think this would be another indication by North Korea's leadership that it's prepared to defy China. It's prepared to defy the international community, the Security Council, and I think what we should do is ratchet up those sanctions immediately. There's a certain amount of discretion in how these sanctions can be implemented, especially the sanction on the import of coal and iron and so forth. I think the way the sanctions are written, the ban on imports really applies when there's indication that the proceeds from the imports will support the nuclear and missile programs. I think China has a little latitude in how it interprets that. I think in the case of a fifth test, this would be an opportunity to interpret that position in a very rigorous way and to cut off or severely restrict its imports of coal and other minerals.
Thank you. To Professor Kim Sung-ha, there's a question like this. Even in case the relationship between the United States and China and the relationship between the United States and Russia worsens, according to Mr. Park of Seoul National University, we need to have a strong cooperation among 5 parties: the US, China, South Korea, Russia, and Japan. And how we can separate the Korean Peninsula issue or North Korean issue from this kind of relationship between bigger powers like the US-China, US-Russia relations, because separating Korean issue from that kind of general international political context may be more helpful for us to resolve this issue.
That's a very difficult question, which means theoretically it is possible to distinguish Korean Peninsula issues from major power relations related issues, but realistically these issues are mixed with each other, which means even when we try to resolve Korean Peninsula issues, particularly the North Korean question, we are not able to eliminate kind of an international dimension that involves major powers' perspectives, particularly the US-China bilateral relationship. For example, even if we are talking about North Korean issue, I believe this issue is likely to be linked with other sub-regional issues such as Taiwan or South China Sea issues. Particularly China sees North Korean issues through the lens of US-China bilateral relationship, and it is hard to deny that the United States does that too. So in that sense, I think it is really hard to distinguish them. But if South Korea tries to take the initiative of confining the agenda to the North Korean issues and restrain itself in inducing the surrounding major powers to deal with the North Korean issues on behalf of herself, I think this kind of a problems or dilemma could be a little bit diluted.
Would you like to have another difficult question?
Okay.
Mr. Kim Sung-ho asked a question as follows. From a short-term perspective, ordinary Korean residents will suffer much as the result of international sanction. And that may be not desirable from the humanitarian perspective. How can we solve this dilemma? We need to apply sanction to North Korea from our strategic perspective, but how to avoid the typical dilemma? I think this is not limited to the North Korean case. And if we apply international sanction strongly against North Korea, ordinary people will suffer.
Again, theoretically, we have to make utmost effort to minimize kind of a collateral damage of our sanctions, meaning we need to minimize the suffering of the innocent people. Again, I want to emphasize so-called the principle of proportionality. If we want to gain 100 points of kind of credit, we have to lose maybe 5 to 10% of losses, which means we have to bear some amount of collateral damages when we try to attain something bigger and something more meaningful. So that's why UN Security Council Resolution 2270, in the case of banning imports of coal and iron, they try to leave some exceptions in the case of kind of the civilian usage for the ordinary people's life. But if North Korea continues to try our patience and rapidly moving toward the final destination of its own game plan, I think we have to run the risk of sacrificing that kind of a part, the humanitarian part, which will be inevitable, unavoidable. There's a Chinese saying that you have to sacrifice plum tree for the peach tree. This is an ancient kind of a war tactic. Okay, so if you want to attain a bigger thing, which is victory, you have to sacrifice some small things or small territories. Okay, so in that sense, I think we got to be realistic. If we are too much obsessed with some humanitarian aspect, humanitarian dimension of our North Korea policy, we can't do anything. Okay, so in that sense, I think the principle of proportionality, I think, should be respected.
Okay, thank you. Professor Sun Shefong, one question to you is, you mentioned the necessity to resume six-party talks as a way of resolving North Korean nuclear problem. According to this questionnaire, I mean, if you didn't mention, don't worry. But what is your personal view about resuming this six-party talk as a main tool for resolving North Korean nuclear threat? Because I think basically that has been the government position of China so far. But the problem is that six-party talks could not succeed in resolving this issue in the last decade. So what is your response to that?
Okay, thank you for your question. That's okay. I did not argue that we need to resume the six-party talk. I just want to argue that in the context of the United States security hierarchy and in the context of the Korea Peninsula nuclear problem, that six-party talk has been one of efforts of the solutions to integrate all the related parties to in one framework. I think that six-party talk achieved the partial success between the 2003 and 2005. Just mentioned by Professor Ingbom. That's okay. We have the agreement in 2005, but now many things have changed. Okay, we need find a new platform and a new way to integrate the related parties in the new framework. I do not just argue that the six-party talk is only the platform, but we need to follow the similar practice to find a way to integrate all the related parties into one framework. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time for us to begin to wrap up our session. And before we do that, I'd like to give probably 2 minutes to each of you, final remarks or whatever you think on this specific topic. Please feel free to talk. Bob, would you?
We've been at this North Korea problem for 25 years now, and nothing has succeeded on a sustained basis. There have been brief intervals when the North Korean threat has been contained, but they always seem to manage to make trouble again. Is this going to be any different? We just don't know whether this is going to be different. But I think the aggressive policies of Kim Jong-un, I think, have awakened the world in a way that it hasn't been awakened before. I think that's manifest in the very strong resolution by the UN Security Council. The question is now whether we're going to sustain the interest in pressuring North Korea and forcing it to the negotiating table and denuclearizing. Are we going to sustain that pressure, or will this be a few months of activity followed by a return to normalcy? I hope this time we're serious about the problem, but that's going to involve real pressure, and if pressure succeeds, it's going to require patient, skillful diplomacy, the dual track that I talked about earlier.
Thank you very much, Professor Sun Shefo.
Okay, thank you. That's okay. I just want to emphasize again that when we talk about any solutions to the East Asia security issues, including North Korea or Korea Peninsula security issues, we need keep the United States special role and its special relations with the security partners in this region in mind. And also I want to summarize my idea that's Mr. Inbon just mentioned that if the Korea Peninsula has further crisis, United States want to ask for China's idea. I don't know China's response, but for myself, I will be contact Professor Yan Xutong and Mr. Douglas Paul, because our department and Carnegie Peace Endowment established a very, very strong arms control program. Yes, we hope that we can find a solution to that.
Thank you, Professor Kim.
Professor Yoon, you asked the question, what kind of lessons we could learn out of our past experience,
Yes.
Such as Iran and Libya. Finally, I can say, the key stakeholders should share the sense of urgency about our final goal, which is denuclearization of North Korea. This is kind of a very direct but kind message to China in particular. And secondly, as I mentioned, the sanctions are just tactical tool. If you want to make it a really strategic tool, it should be combined with negotiations. But when North Korea is ready to negotiate in a serious manner, that's my second point. And finally, we need a division of labor among UN and key concerned parties and other UN members, as we got some lessons from the case of Iran. Okay, the UN provided some sort of guidelines, and P5+1 were doing some leading action, and the rest of the other UN members were doing supportive action. Likewise, UN is now implementing, has adopted the Security Council resolution. This is kind of a guideline, okay? And then key six-party members, mostly the 5 parties, are supposed to lead, and the rest of the other international community members are supposed to do kind of a supportive action. One more thing, in the case of Libya, PSI, Proliferation Security Initiative, was really effective, which means the coalition of the willing. Coalition of the willing is really important, together with the support from the international community. So in that sense, I think we, key stakeholders, should pay attention to how to form the coalition of willing to come up with the really meaningful results of our effort, which means denuclearization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Bob and Seong-han have made summary of key points of this session in a very succinct way. The first, the necessity of strong cooperation among 5 parties and international society to pressure North Korea at this stage. And they also pointed out that this kind of pressure should be backed by diplomacy, which would resume sometime later. I think those are the key points that we draw from our discussion this morning. And I appreciate each presenter very much for your very insightful presentation and discussion. And thank you all your audience for listening carefully and asking important questions. Thank you very much.